Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 147. Today we're talking about Babel. We'll figure out how to say it. We are your hosts today, Justin Brown, Leon Revel, and Amal Hussein. Hello, wonderful people. How's it going?
Hey, everyone.
And before we introduce our guest this week and talk about all things transformations, I'm going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon?
As always, thank you very much, Justin. So first of all, we've got an intent to ship image decoding attribute in Chrome. So this would allow developers to choose performance over presentation when it comes to loading images in a web page. That sounds quite exciting. Angular 5.1 has recently been released, which has got several bug fixes and small features. Some of these features include service worker support in the CLI, improved decorator, error messages, and TypeScript 2.5 support. There's been a new release of ESLint, that's version 4.13, which has got new features and several bug fixes. Jason Miller has just announced Unistore, which is a 650-byte state container with preact bindings. And there's a new web platform API being proposed, which is the device memory API. And it'll basically add a device memory property to the navigator object, exposing the amount of RAM available on a particular device, which would be pretty useful. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. The image decoding attribute, that makes me happy. I hear that that's going to get picked up quite a bit by other browser vendors as well. So should be lots of fun. Because I like performance, and who doesn't like performance? And speaking of performance, today we're talking about Babel. We've got Henry on the show. Henry, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about the wonderful world of Babel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So for those who don't know you, Henry, I mean, you've been around the block, but for those who don't, who have not heard of you, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm Henry. Right now I'm a JavaScript engineer at Behance, which is a part of Adobe. And I moved up to New York from Georgia about 2 years ago. I actually got my job at Behance through doing open source on a project called JSCS. And I kind of, maybe a lot of people don't know this, but I kind of stumbled upon Babel. I didn't really know what it did, but I thought it was really interesting. Slowly, did more things and became the maintainer.
Not an easy thing to do, to randomly stumble upon a project and just magically then become the maintainer of that thing. I mean, that is fairly impressive.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I guess I saw that, it was really interesting or exciting to me to see a project that, can transform code. And I think for basically every single person that works on Babel, even the creator, Sebastian, none of us knew how compilers worked. We didn't study it or something. It was, we learned everything on the fly. And that's why I kind of want to encourage other people to get involved in open source, because everyone assumes that, you have to have, some kind of previous knowledge to be able to be involved. But really bringing, the skills that you have to the table, maybe not even development related, is really useful. Whether it's documentation or videos or the changelog or just things that maybe as the creator you might not be able to think of. Yeah.
So I imagine the majority of people have probably come across Babel at some point in their developer lives. But for anybody who doesn't know what it is, could you give us a kind of short introduction of exactly what it is?
Yeah, for sure. So on our homepage, we say that Babel is a JavaScript compiler. And since compiler isn't the most, I guess, easy approachable word, we say that Babel is a tool that transforms code, and specifically it transforms JavaScript to JavaScript. And so I like to say that it's not something that any other language would need, because if you need to update a language on the server, say Python, like Python 2 to Python 3, then you would just update it. But because JavaScript runs on the client and you have no idea which browser a user is using, you can't assume what version of JavaScript they're using. And so the purpose of Babel is to create a tool so that you shouldn't have to think about what browsers your users are using. And it turns the version of JavaScript that you're writing in, which could be a later version, not supported in that browser, and convert it to a backwards compatible version.
So that's really fascinating that you describe it that way, because I'm a little fascinated by Babel because of the evolution of the project. Like it grew in scope and popularity and magnitude and awesomeness, because I think it originally just started out as something where it was called 5 to 6, wasn't it? Like, wasn't it the initial version of Babel called 5 to 6, and it was simply just to convert ES5 to ES6? Is that correct?
Yeah, so actually it's the opposite. 6 to 5. It converts the version
6 to 5.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah, it's easy to get confused. It converted specifically the 6th version of JavaScript into the 5th version of JavaScript. The 6th version of JavaScript had a lot of new changes, especially syntax related, and it was been in the works for a really long time. And some browsers are implementing them, but everyone's supporting older browsers. So the idea is that why isn't there a way to be able to use it before all your users are using that latest browser? And Babel wasn't the first project to do this. There was a project at Google called Tracer that did the same thing. But Babel was able to, I guess, be more widely used across the community rather than being just more of an experiment. But really, the community took it forward, and that's why everyone's using it now. But funny thing is that there is a project that is called 5 to 6, and it does the opposite of Babel, where like if you want to use Babel, you have to write your source code in ES6. So you have to go through all your code and change it. But we can write another tool that automates part of that for you, so that in certain cases there is an easy way to translate ES5 to ES6. And when Babel got renamed from 6 to 5 to Babel, that project got renamed from 5 to 6 to Babel, which is like Babel backwards.
Oh. Wow, that's pretty cool. So there's a tool to automate teams like who may want to just like mass upgrade their code bases, essentially. Right.
Facebook has this term for it called CodeMa, which is code modification. But basically, it's you want to be able to automate certain changes to your code base. And it's basically kind of like a refactor in a sense. Like I know React and other tools now, if they change an API, they change the name of a method, then they can like automate that across a whole code base instead of having to manually do it. So like in one case, it's like React prop types, and then changing it to use the prop types npm package. And so in the same way, we could do this with syntax. And we haven't done this yet, but Babel itself has its own implementation of certain things. I would like it to be able to just be a Babel like transform itself. And that way, it will be easier to sync between the two projects. Ideally, every single proposal that we have should have a transform to convert back to the equivalent syntax, so that if a proposal gets dropped, then someone can automatically remove it, so that they don't have to do them themselves. And it also gives them more, I guess, confidence in using something that is new, because then they can always get rid of it. Because people are scared, like, oh, what if it gets removed? And then another thing is that if a proposal gets updated in between stages, then we can use this code mod to automatically like upgrade them.
That's really interesting. So I'm really excited. Like I have a bunch of questions around proposals and how people are using things that are really early stage in production. But I think we can save that for later. Can you elaborate a little bit on the relationship that Babel now has with the TC39, which is the technical steering committee for JavaScript? Because Babel is an official implementer now, and I believe you're an invited expert. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's kind of correct. So I kind of feel like Babel for a long time was kind of in a position where it was talked about a lot in the committee, but we didn't really have representation on the project or the committee itself. I know Sebastian was able to attend a few years ago when he first did it, but it was only recently that I think we've pursued after actually going to meetings. I went to my first meeting in May, and I mean, this is kind of like when I meant I randomly stumbled upon the project. I kind of randomly was able to go because the meeting happened to be in New York, and so I was able to just walk over there because it was at Google, and I was able to give a presentation on what's the importance of Babel to TC39 itself. Maybe there aren't. I think people know what it is, but maybe they're not seeing. I guess the actual importance of it. Like everyone says it's important, but we're not seeing any that much backing behind it until recently. So I'm glad that a lot of TC39 members have been trying to get more involved in communicating with our project, because we're not a company, we're not a full-time team at anything. Most of the representatives work at these huge companies, and at least they get paid part-time to work on it. But for us, it's we're still trying to keep up with whatever is going on in the project itself and also with TC39. So I'd like to see, more companies being more invested in it if they think that it's important enough to do that. And the reason is because, Babel was created to convert existing things that are not proposals, so things that are going to be in JavaScript, ES6, that's actually done, and then converting that to a previous version. But now it's well, we can use Babel to implement things before they're actually in the language. And the reasoning is because we have a lot of users, and so people can test things out before they're actually implemented in the browser, which can cost lots of money and lots of time to implement it, in C++ in the browser, and to have to ship that to all their users. Babel can be a testing bed where people can give feedback and make the proposal better, so that users don't get surprised when there's a proposal that gets to stage 4 and it gets into language. You're like, well, I didn't need this, or this is too slow, or something like that. So yeah, I'd like to see, I don't know, just a lot more help for this project, given that it's such an important part of this ecosystem.
A lot of times people seem to have a misunderstanding of just how large that ecosystem actually is. Because one reason that Babel sort of exists within the context of the transforms that it does is so that you can use new things now, right? Not just the experimental stuff, but shipping in a wide variety of platform stuff. Because JavaScript has sort of traveled into lands that people at least I didn't think people understood JavaScript would go. I mean, a lot of times I get the question of, why would I need to use Babel if I'm only ever programming for evergreen browsers? And then usually my response to that is, why? How can you only ever program for those things? Are you specific to that target? Because if you look at a lot of statistics for those sort of people who often tell me these things, they're completely cutting out an entire swath of people who cannot use these new features yet, which is where Babel sort of fills that gap. And that ecosystem is large. I have no concept at this point of how large the number of implementations of JavaScript in its various forms sort of exists within the span of the world. But that number seems quite large now, unless someone would care to disagree with me on that. fairly large number. We can all agree on that. Lots of
Yeah, no,
implementations.
huge, yeah, lots of implementations, and JavaScript is running, and Babel projects support JavaScript on the server too, in the Node.js world. So that's the other interesting. It's everywhere. And actually, can you confirm the monthly downloads? Last time I checked, it was around 11 million. Is that correct?
Yeah, something like that. 11 million a month.
Yeah, that's huge. And so. We've mentioned this word transform a few times. I'm wondering if you can kind of just elaborate on it for our listeners, Henry. Like, what are transforms, and what are the types of transforms that are available within Babel?
Right. So transform, I like to think of it as, it's an input-output tool. And so it takes a string of code, a piece of code, and it just turns it into another piece of code that, the browser can consume. And even the way I could even explain how it works really simply, there's 3 parts to a generic compiler, and that's what Babel uses. There's a parser, takes a string, and it turns it into an AST, abstract syntax tree. And I like to think of that as just some kind of JSON. And then the second step is that it transforms that JSON into some other JSON. And then the third step is it converts that JSON back into a string. And so a compiler, all it does is it, turns a string into another string, but it's hard to manipulate strings by themselves because it's more error prone. And so by turning it into a format more suitable to transformation like JSON, that way we're able to be more confident about the changes that we're making. A really simple example of this is like, if you wanted to do a find replace to transform something, maybe you're searching for like a variable name or something, but maybe that name could be found with Control F as a string, as a variable name, or as a comment. And so having an AST helps you to know like, oh, this is a comment, this is a string, this is a variable. So be able to define each part of the syntax makes it easier to transform it. And then also the kinds of things that you can do. So the main purpose of Babel is to transform syntax, like an arrow function to a regular function or a class to a function. But you can also do other things. A lot of people, because Babel is it works for syntax, so then you can also do it for other things. So people use it to add different additions to code, maybe during development time. You can like remove console.log, or you can add metadata. People use it to make plugins for code coverage. You could even do it for linting, or there's so many different things you can do. I think people have a hard time seeing like what's possible because we don't have a lot of examples, but we're seeing a lot of interesting things from the community.
How do you guys keep up with the amount of possible transformations that you could do, like all of the proposals and all of the new features of the language? Like, where do you begin? Especially as you said, you're not on this full time. How do you even begin to tackle that huge problem?
Yeah, it's a hard question. There's like, the more you learn, the more that you feel like you don't know about. And I think you just have to kind of choose what you're interested in, or what what time allows for you to do. I guess for me, as more of the maintainer role, I try to keep up with like an overall sense of what people are doing, and try not to go too in depth into certain parts of it, and allow people that are more interested in that. And I think that's part of the nice thing about open source, is that I guess that even though you're not paid for it, that also means you have the freedom to work on what you want. In my case, I do want to help other people to get involved in the project, so it's more of like a overseer or whatever, maintainer role. In terms of the like proposals, that's not too bad, because TC39, the committee, they meet every 2 months. So we know about the kinds of things they're thinking about. There's also a TC39 repo, so you can see that I recently made a repo which you can go to. It's Babel/proposals. And there what I do is we track all the different proposals and the stages and the progress that we're at in terms of like how far we are with transformation or not. And then every meeting I make a new issue, and then during the meeting someone can write down like, oh, this thing got moved to stage 1 or stage 2, or it got dropped or moved down to a stage. And as long as there's someone at the meeting that's able to do that, which not everyone's able to attend because they're in person, but you can call online. That's how we keep track of that stuff.
That sounds really, really useful. I mean, it's often quite difficult to really get a sense of where all these different proposals are moving, and it's quite difficult. So it'd be great if we can share that in the show notes so people could take a look.
Yeah, and speaking of proposals and what stages they're in, one of the things that I often worry about is I see a lot of development teams using stage 1, 2 features and in their production projects. And, Babel, for better or worse, has made it really, really easy to do that, which is great. But what is the team doing to kind of let people know that the APIs are in flux, and I know that we can use code mods to change them, but is there generally education around that for users of the project?
I feel like this could be its own episode. So I mean, this is like an education problem, and that's probably the hardest thing you can do, because it's like all the things that we do to change this project, in the end, how do we get what we want the community to know, like our vision, to spread across to all these developers? And that's just really hard, and it's a lot more complicated than just like making it harder to do that, because there are plenty of people that they're new, and then they're like, now there's JavaScript fatigue, and we have whatever hundreds of reports of people are like, oh, this is so hard to use now. All that stuff. There was I had this idea of removing the stage presets. And I think there are probably a lot of people that would be okay with that, because the idea is that you should just, opt into each proposal that you're using explicitly. And that makes sense, because you should know the kinds of syntax that you're trying to use. And if you don't know what it does, then why are you using it, especially if it's not JavaScript? But my thinking there is that if we remove it, then someone's going to just make it anyway, and then the community is going to use that. And I'd rather kind of not really have control, but at least have a say in how people are using it, even if it means that people are going to use this preset. We can introduce a warning or better messaging around that kind of thing. But if we just remove it, then someone else is just going to do something, I think, that would harm it even more. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's a weird balance that we have to have. It sucks that it's kind of on us, because you're like, TC39, they obviously don't want anyone to use like any of the stuff in Babel except if it's supported already. And then all the users want to use the thing, not even when it's stage 0. They'll probably want to use it when it's stage -1, right? Like someone just has an idea and they want a Babel plugin for it. And for us, it's like, okay, how do we balance that? Like, we want developers to be able to use, new syntax in a real way, not just for like fun, but like that they're actually testing it out. Because if it's just for fun, maybe the feedback won't be there. They'll just be like, this is okay, and then it'll move on. So maybe we need like a way to scale up, like, oh, when it's at stage 2, then you should try it out even more. I don't really know exactly how to change it, because most people that are using it, they don't even know Babel exists, right? It's just like some thing in the background, or another tool is like the thing that kind of abstracts over it. Like I talk to people at conferences, they're like, they don't know what it is. So it's almost like, I don't know what we're supposed to do about that messaging, and maybe it's the tools on top of it that should do something.
Just before we,
I think it's a valid point. Sorry, go ahead, Liam.
No,
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Just before we move any further, I just wanted to ask for anybody who isn't familiar with the TC39 staging process, Henry, could you just describe the different stages and what they mean?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, I wanted to answer that. So I didn't really understand what they were either, even though they're defined in the document and we have it on our docs too. But now that I've been to some meetings and to hearing about what people say, what I think of it now, it seems like stage 0 means that it's just an idea and that someone on TC39 is planning on presenting it to the committee. And so that means that literally it doesn't have any vetting yet. It's just like anyone could have came up with that. So if you're using something that's stage 0, it's, it's just like an aspirational idea, like, oh, this would be interesting. And, maybe half the people wouldn't agree with that. And then once it gets to stage 1, the idea is that the committee agrees that the problem that proposal is trying to solve is something that the committee wants to look into. So not that the proposal itself is good, but that the problem it's trying to fix is a good problem to fix for JavaScript. And then stage 2 is when that proposal itself, the idea around that is a viable solution to the problem from stage 1. And then stage 3 says that this specific proposal with actual specification text is what we want to pursue. And then we want to just iron out all the different small issues. And then once you get to stage 4, we're saying this is done. This is going to be in JavaScript. There are 2 browsers that implemented it, and we even have tests, official JavaScript tests for that proposal.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you. That really kind of clears it all up much more than what you can read online. I'm going to snip out that piece of recording and play it to myself every morning.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I first learned about the proposal process through Babel's website, believe it or not, because it was so kind of clearly laid out. There's, straw man, and I was like, what are these things? And then I dug into it some more. So thank you for that education many years ago, you and the team. So Henry, can you talk a little bit about, so we understand that presets are, how people opt into different transforms, and there's this like awesome new preset that you came out with recently called Babel Preset Env. Can you elaborate on what that is and why it's amazing?
Yeah, so this kind of goes into the name change a bit. Babel used to be called 6-5, and then the reasoning behind the name change is that, you're going to have to change the name every time there's a new version of JavaScript. It's like 7-5 and 8-5. And so we changed it to Babel because it's more generic, right? It's supposed to work across all of the languages. And so the change that happened recently is that, all these evergreen browsers, they now support ES6 natively. So if you type an arrow function or a class or something in the browser, then it'll work without you having to use Babel in the first place. And of course, this means a lot of people start asking, well, why do I need to use Babel anymore? Because the browser supports it. And so this is something that people have been asking for a long time, is what if Babel could somehow let you not transform certain things that are supported natively. And I think that's probably been a thing that's, people have had this idea since maybe even the beginning of it. But it's something that, well, it's a lot of work, first of all. And so I don't think anyone wanted to maintain this whole basically essentially chart of every browser and every feature and which version of each browser supports what feature, and then somehow linking that together to somehow turn off certain plugins. And so what I did was I finally was we can actually do this. And thankfully I was able to actually spend time at work making this happen. And so that's how preset env came about. preset env stands for preset environment. Maybe it's not the best name. Maybe it could have been like target or something. But the idea is that you can opt into specifying which browsers you want to target. And Babel will automatically turn on or turn off the plugins that are needed for the targets that you specify. So an example is that if you specify like Chrome, the latest Chrome, then it will like turn off basically every plugin that Chrome already supports, which in this case might be everything except like import until recently. And if you don't specify anything, then it'll just compile everything down to ES3 or ES5. And the way this works is that currently it uses the Kangex compatibility table, which is essentially a giant Excel sheet of not only all the browsers, but like different like Node and different all the different implementations of JavaScript and all the different features, and we kind of like match the versions with the actual plugins. Each Babel or each syntax has a corresponding Babel plugin. And so like if the browser supports arrow functions, then we can turn off that plugin and it won't run. Yeah.
Super cool. So you're basically able to save a lot of developers on bundle sizes, right? Because they're not necessarily, sometimes they're only transpiling what they need to transpile for the browser versions that they support. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So along with that it's not just like it saves a lot of different things. It doesn't just save code size, it also saves the you having to think about like what year that you're doing. So like before we had like ES 2015, ES 2016, you have to like install and configure all of those. And then now there's going to be a 18, 19, 20. I think it seems kind of absurd to have to like keep adding these things per year. And so I made this other preset called preset latest. I didn't know what the right name for that either was, but I just picked one in the end. And all that did was just an array of presets that was 15, 16, 17. And so env is just like the better version of that, so that you don't have to you shouldn't have to have any other preset in terms of like syntax. Yeah, so I kind of think of it as a progression of how Babel should work. It's like it should get smaller in terms of the amount of things you have to think about. Ideally, we wouldn't have any configuration. So you think about from like the minimum viable thing is that what should a developer have to know about their configuration, and at the very least they have to know what browsers they support. And so that's why we also support this format called browsers list, and it's the same thing that's used in auto prefixer. So if you want, you can just use that same config file for both tools, which is really nice. Yeah, that's another thing.
That's pretty cool. I just switched over one of my projects to use this, so I want to say thank you. I hope to never have to write 2000 anything in my in my config files again. So it's an awesome plugin. For those of you who haven't started using it, you should check it out. It's really easy for you to maintain, and also make your QA team and product team feel more confident as well about all the fun, crazy things we're doing with modern JavaScript. So Henry, I'm wondering if you can talk about the TypeScript story with Babel. So TypeScript comes with its own compiler, right? So a lot of TypeScript users have zero need for Babel, but there is some plugin for Babel and TypeScript. Can you share what that's about and what the who the audience is there?
Yeah. I wanted to touch one more point on preset env.
Sure, go ahead.
It's interesting that just thinking about maintaining open source in general, it's I think I made the preset a year ago, and it still has less downloads than the 2015 preset, which is kind of funny. I deprecated those presets a while ago, but what it tells me is that, it's really hard to, get the whole community to update. And so I've been thinking a lot about like, how do we actually do that? People talk about it at conferences and then you deprecate it. And, it's just, I think we kind of move forward and we forget everyone that's like still there's people still on like Babel 5 and like all this stuff. It's like, it's a hard problem to do that because, most people, they just want to like move on with the project and then just hope that people will update eventually. So that's something I've been thinking about.
I think it's a tough thing to do. I mean, you don't really. It is very difficult for some organizations to move once they've developed that thing, and I think that's why legacy stuff is the way it is. It's not that there isn't, until that deprecation path breaks something. Fundamentally, it's if it's not broke, don't fix it, or don't change its scenario. And as a maintainer, I can only imagine the amount of additional overhead that puts on top of you. People filing tickets for things that are deprecated out, things that are no longer supported. That can be a drain on your time, just having to sit there and go, we haven't used that for a year. We haven't used that for 3, right? And that can, trying to find that middle ground to try to deliver something, but at the same time, somehow try to keep everybody happy. I don't know how winnable that is. But a lot of corps, as someone who deals with a lot of legacy code, people, it'd be lovely if everyone was on the latest versions of everything. I'm just happy if I can get them to move into the 21st century for the most part.
Yeah. But I would say that, and Henry, to your point, though, there is a story behind that. I think there's a few things, like one, the general mistrust, right? People have not always had the smoothest path when trying to upgrade versions of anything, right, in open source or non-open source. And so there's a general mistrust and there's a general need for, I think, teams to like allocate time to update their configs or dependencies, and so unless you have this really awesome flow with continuous integration and you're able to you have really good unit test coverage and that you're not breaking anything, it's really, it's the path to upgrading and migration is not always smooth for most development teams. Secondly, I think that like a lot of tutorials and a lot of reference material already on the web references those presets. So, you'd have to anybody who's taking an old course on XYZ, they might be, more familiar with some of the older presets than the newer ones, so it's definitely it's a big battle, but, don't give up, and also know that, yes, you're pushing the web forward, and Babel also helps push the web forward. But I think the story of people not upgrading their dependencies in the timely manner that we all wish they would, that seems to be a wider open source problem. It's not limited to Babel.
I suppose it wouldn't matter I suppose it wouldn't matter if those, from my standpoint, it doesn't matter unless they start complaining. And I see that kind of abuse a lot in terms of what maintainers have to deal with. It's one thing if you don't want to upgrade because you're afraid of a breaking change, which if you're working for an organization or you're working on some code project that is inherent to your ongoing existence as an employee there, again, why are you screaming at open source maintainers because they won't maintain something that's 5 years old? Or you didn't, I don't want to move because of X. Well, you have the provision to do so. And I think that's the thing that hurts me the most, because there's not, I've tried to convince people in other organizations in the past, don't sit there and abuse the people that A, you're not paying, and B, that you're gaining massive amount of ground for. Again, if you don't want to upgrade, then that's your prerogative, right, against whatever version or target it is. And I agree also that with you, Amal, that sometimes the tutorials aren't up to date, and then but with env preset, right? If you go to the old 2015, there's a deprecation notice on the top. Just click here. At some point, you can only do so much before you just go, I have to move on because my sanity requires it.
Yeah, I agree. But we also like there's an education aspect here, and I think there's like some community work that we can do, right? Like in educating developer teams, tech leads, right? Product owners. Like a developer is not that we don't work in silos, right? We have entire teams of people that are stakeholders that need to come along with the journey, and so. I think there's some work that needs to be done in that area, but it's hard. I mean, it's a hard.
Join us in our next podcast where we talk about product management and what it means to you.
It's hard. Trust me. I've been in meetings where people freak out about these things, right? And the reality is like sometimes it's a smooth upgrade and sometimes it's not, and so it's a legitimate fear for some teams.
Yeah,
so.
for a lot of businesses that just need to crank stuff out to make some money, upgrading anything's the last thing on their mind. But Justin's so right there in saying that, well, don't moan at people that are doing stuff for free that are saving you loads of time,
Yeah, I don't understand why the animosity. Like, I think we've had this conversation before on the podcast. I don't understand the animosity to scream at people about your upgrade path when literally it's everybody only has so much time, right? And again, I don't envy the decisions that you have to make on a daily basis, Henry. I can only imagine. I mean, I watch the tickets and see the conversation, but I mean, you guys do a massive amount of work on a product that fundamentally is at the core of so many other teams at this point. I mean, the amount of juggling that you must do on a daily basis, it must be quite high.
Yeah. That's kind of like why I tweeted recently I was going to I said I was going to step back and maybe people thought I wasn't going to work on it anymore, but it's just like I think wanted to focus on other things, try to think about things at more of a high level. Because it does take a long time. And I still really like working on it, but you just can't devote that much energy into those kinds of things. I think in the end, it's just that, things that are infrastructure related, no one wants to care about. And so people also think that, I kind of say that Babel is a victim of its own success in a sense that because we're in a place where open source, or at least these kinds of projects, aren't like a company or anything, everyone assumes they are because it's so widely downloaded. Like every time someone's like, oh, Babel's downloaded 11 million times or whatever, then no one even thinks again, oh, who's actually working on this thing or whatever. And so when they make the issue, they're just, they're frustrated because, something broke, that they happen to find a bug in the project and they report and they get really mad and they don't realize there's a person on the other end. So the problem is, I think they forget that the project is a few people. Even if it was a whole team, it's that doesn't mean you should do that. But
yeah, well, I mean, this also goes just, this is a wider open source issue. And that's kind of what I was alluding to about open source being infrastructure, right? If we treat it like roads and bridges and all these other things, right, we would have more respect for it. And I think, Justin's point is that, Babel is this project which is core and fundamental to so many important, important projects on the internet. And, are we giving Babel, its maintainers and its project the support and the love and the creds that it should? I don't think so. So but anyways, but now we're rambling and we're sort of off topic, but it's a healthy tangent, but it is a small tangent. But yeah, I mean, actually, Henry, you gave this really great talk. So I think more than once called maintainer heal thyself, right? And you get into these idioms and situations around open source development and what is it like to be an open source maintainer. And it's really not as glamorous as most people make it out to be. Yes, there's the rock stars and that are revered, but even them, they get a lot of CRAP. I don't know if I can curse on this podcast, but you guys get the drift. So yeah.
Yeah. I think the point I was trying to make there was that it's really easy to not see the other person's side. So I mean, as a maintainer, we can feel just as entitled as a developer that's reporting an issue. Like, I deserve to be treated in this way because I'm maintaining it and all this stuff. And so the problem is that, when someone responds negatively, then you're going to respond back negatively. So it's really like, how do we, respond back in a positive way, even if people treat you in that way? And for that to change how people are acting, not that we're going to do the same thing back to them. And that's just really hard to do. But I'd like to, hope that we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm eager to see where, hopefully more continued and more sustainable support for Babel goes. And, I don't know if there's any news that you'd like to share on that front, if there's been some more progress, but I'm hoping that, some more companies step up to kind of take Babel under their wing in that sense. And thank you, I guess, Adobe, for at least letting you work on it half-time, which is really nice.
Yeah. I can. I'll talk about the TypeScript part.
Yeah, back to the regularly scheduled podcast.
So TypeScript. I guess Babel has been supporting Flow for a long time. I guess I don't even remember when it happened. Maybe it was before I started. And I think that was mostly just because Sebastian worked at Facebook, and they added JSX and they added Flow, both which are not they're not JavaScript. They're probably never going to be in the standard. And so I guess people have been asking for that kind of thing for a long time because TypeScript's kind of like Flow. It has a type system and a certain syntax, and the way the Flow plugin works is that it just parses all the Flow types and then it removes them. That way, that when you send it to the browser or Node or something, that it'll run correctly. And so people, people that are using TypeScript, they want the same thing for Babel. And so we reached out to the TypeScript team at Microsoft, did a call with them. Well, I basically said that I would be willing for us to do that only if they would, implement it and do the PR and also help maintain it when they add new things. It just doesn't seem reasonable for us to have to do all that work in addition to all the regular work. And this is the same for Flow as well. Or the community does it or something. It's just like, that's a lot of upfront work. So I'm really glad that Andy on the TypeScript team, he was able to submit those PRs, even though we had to review them, which is also a lot of work. But it's really cool to see that partnership happen. And I guess some people might wonder, why would you want to use Babel and TypeScript together? I think it's mostly that if you use TypeScript, then maybe you can't use any of the other Babel plugins in the ecosystem. So non-syntax related plugins, maybe it's for CSS and JS or I guess GraphQL and React Native, stuff like that. You have to use a Babel plugin for that at the moment. And so if you can compile everything with Babel, then you can still continue to use those things. And then the other thing is that, another thing you can do is that you could use TypeScript, and then you have all the stuff with the IDE to make development better. But then when you're running, it can compile with Babel, which it can run a lot faster than TypeScript because it doesn't actually run the types themselves. And so it's doing a lot less work. And so that your build time can be a lot faster as well.
That's super cool. We're missing our TypeScript nerd here, Danny. He wasn't able to join the podcast today, but let's see, Justin, can we think of some questions that Danny would ask?
I can't do my Danny voice. I don't have a particular Danny voice of things, but along the TypeScript lines, I mean, you talk about their contribution and the fact that you had to sort of obviously you had to review it and before it got merged in. Do you find the community contributes a lot in terms of presets? Because I mean, really, we've talked about sort of presets and plugins and those sort of things. I mean, there is quite a large community around that. Not all things get reviewed within your set. I mean, do you find that the community really has started to contribute to the overall ecosystem to make Babel sort of expand into these new regions pretty readily as new things come up in the sort of developer tooling world?
If you mean in terms of like different kinds of plugins, then yeah, I feel like, the community is better at, they're the ones, using all these different libraries and coming up with different ideas and then seeing like, oh, I can make a Babel plugin for this, and then they go ahead and do it, which is really good. But for us, I guess it just means more maintenance burden, because it's like, well, assuming that we want to take that on, it's like, how do we make sure that plugins are high quality and have tests and aren't going to break when we do the next version of Babel and like all that stuff. And that makes me think like, okay, maybe we need like an official test, like plugin testing thing, like modules, so you don't have to do it yourself. And then through that, we can create like linting and warnings on how to write plugins in the way that is more efficient and all that stuff. So I think, we do rely on the community to come up with different ideas. And we kind of have to look through like what are the patterns on what people are doing and figure out how to change the core so that that works better for everybody. And I think that's how most platforms work, right? It's like with the language too, it's like we should look to the community to see what are the problems we have with JavaScript, and not ask like the community itself to just think of a idea just because they thought it was good, but because people are actually using this in production and this is a problem, they had to make all these workarounds around it.
Yeah, I think that overall, we're running a little short on time now, but I want to just point out that, again, I'm still amazed at the sheer amount of things you deal with. You're talking about, we should manage this plugin ecosystem and also the core set and also TC39 and also, what do the browsers do? And what's along the lines of compatibility matrix? And again, really, my hat goes off to y'all. Like the sheer notion that these things are particularly easy to overcome on any given day is simply not true. I mean, the amount of work you must put in as a whole to make sure that this thing continues to work. I just want to say thank you for all the developers out there who haven't gotten to talk to you. So thank you very much. Because that is a very difficult thing to juggle.
Yeah, I'd like to ditto that as well. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know where I'd be without Babel, really. I'd still be writing var everywhere. It'd be a hideous life.
Yeah, really. Thank you, Henry. And for those of you listening, Babel has an open source collective fund. If you love Babel, donate. Tell your teams to donate. Ping your manager and tell your manager to donate. So there's lots of opportunities to give back that are not just with your time, but with your money. So you can do that as well. And we'll link the open source collective in the show notes. And with that said, Henry, I'd love to invite you back on our show to talk a little bit more about, open source fatigue and kind of, the things that you talked about in your talk, maintain or heal thyself. And so if you're open to it, we would love to have you back to talk about that, because I agree that's a show topic within itself, and it's very interesting one. So.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. So with that said, Justin, do you want to wrap it up?
Sure. Well, we want to thank our guest Henry this week for coming on episode number 147 of the Web Platform Podcast. Tune in next week when we talk about more things on the web, where Justin will probably make more terrible jokes. And ideally, you'll learn a little bit something more about the web that you didn't know before. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your week.